me know when you're ready. Good? Okay. So this is, what we're really going to be talking about here is why you should understand how stories work when it comes to engaging with people who are non-believers. This morning I talked about how apologetics can be used for both believers and non-believers as a way to build up our faith. This is going to be mostly aimed towards non-believers. Okay, so introductions. Most of you guys don't know me. My name is Joe Fontenot. Everybody's like, how do you say your last name? So it's all there except for the last T. It's just extra. So you just pronounce it all until you get to the T and you'll be fine. So I'm working on a PhD in apologetics. Next door, I mentioned this a minute ago, Dr. Bob Stewart is my supervisor. And I'm from New Orleans. This is where I grew up, born and raised. And I moved to East Tennessee, which is where my wife is from. Did that in 2020. So as the world was just getting upside down and weird, we just moved across the country. And so that's where I live now. I'm a director of GO, which is like a missional lifestyle for our church there. I normally don't put this last part on here, but it's actually kind of relevant because I did a deep dive into this and I wrote 3 novels. And so you'll see why that's relevant in a minute. Okay, so here's what we're going to cover. The 3 parts of every story. The 5 core elements within every story. So that's less of a structure and just things that you're going to find within it. And we'll go through examples. The biblical story and why you should know this. And then where are you in the story? Some of this might feel a little bit like, where are we going with this? So just hang on. All right. So you have 3 parts of every story. Beginning, a middle, and an end. I'm glad you guys didn't pay for this. What this really looks like, though, is you have a problem, a solution, and a resolution. Okay? So if you think about like maybe a Disney movie or something like that that's very like this, a classic story that we're kind of familiar with. This is really always what it is. Now, sometimes you'll have things before this, like what we'll call a setting and stuff. There's more nuance to this, but we're just going to focus on these 3 really big rocks, right? So you have a problem, then you have a solution. The question is, will the solution work? And then you have a resolution. This is the happy ending. All right, so I'm going to give you some basic kind of stuff, and then we're going to come back and kind of start to put all this together. So our 5 core elements in a story. You have characters. You can't have a story without characters. You can't have a story without context. If you change the context of a story, everything else being the same, really the story changes. So the context plays a role as much as anything else. Foreshadowing, this is one that might be like, wait, what's this? Foreshadowing, there's a great quote. I'm going to pull it up in a minute to kind of explain what this is, but foreshadowing is kind of like looking ahead without telling us exactly what's coming. Sort of setting the stage. You've got tension. If there's no tension, then we don't pay attention. That's not a play on words. That's just, And then finally you have stakes. What difference does it make? If we don't have anything to lose, then who cares? All right, so let's talk about these real quick. Characters. A lot of times when we think of ourselves, we are kind of oh, look at that. I could fix this. Maybe. Bo said I could just put it in once. What room is this? 461? 462. It says it's on there. Oh, that's Andrew. He's trying to do it. See, I knew what I was doing. I just didn't know he didn't know what he was doing. He's right there. Thank you. He's probably like, this thing. Is it ready? Okay. Let me just set this up real quick. Let's see, screen mirroring. 62.
Joe, did you fix it?
I think so. Let's see.
Yeah, we tried.
Yes.
Okay, that's good.
Yes. Okay. So we have characters. So we're just looking through these. Oops. Well, it doesn't matter. I clicked the button and it, anyway. So characters, a lot of times we think of ourselves as the hero in the story. Now that's not a braggadocious kind of thing. This is just kind of like the story is happening to me. I am walking through the story. When we watch a movie or look at a novel, we identify often, not necessarily like in an I want to be this person, but the story is built around that protagonist or the hero. So the really important thing to understand here is you're not the hero in the story that we're going to be talking about. Your dialogue partner is, okay? You're not the savior. Jesus is. I think we know that one. The role that you're going to play, you're the guide. So if you think of kind of famous stories, who is the guide in Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit? That would be Gandalf, right? He's the wise one helping the hero get where they need to get. We're going to come back to that. Second is context. The context, there's something wrong. The world is not the way it should be, right? We can already kind of see the seeds of the gospel in that, right? But there's hope. God, the mighty King, is coming, and when He does, He will restore justice in His kingdom. Come on in. Hey, come on in.
Oh, sorry, late.
It's okay. It's okay.
We were in the wrong room.
It's all right.
We were thinking 461, it should have been 460.
Happens to me too. So, catch you guys up super quick. We're going through the basic ideas of what makes a story. So we talked about character, talked about context. So as you read this, you can see really a lot of the things we talk about when we share the gospel or the story of the gospel. Foreshadowing. All right, this is where we help our dialogue partner emphasize the details that they've shared that will have a big impact later in their story. This is... When I say the word dialogue partner, this is something I introduced earlier, and I should have introduced it again. What I mean by that is, this is just, it could be pretty obvious, but this is just the person that you're talking to, the person you're having this apologetic encounter with. So it could go on and on and on with the same person. It could just be a one-off of a person you meet in a coffee shop or at Home Depot or wherever. However you're in this, this is the kind of thing you're thinking about. Okay? I'm going to bring all this together in a moment. We have tension. If you're like me, you like to fix the problems. You don't like the problems to be there. You want to come in and soothe. So I say resist with an exclamation point because that's for me. Tension serves an important purpose. This is what moves the story forward. We want to resolve that tension. We don't want to resolve it too quickly, otherwise you don't have a story. You had to start. We want to resolve it at the right time. And then finally we have stakes. This is the big so what. What difference does it make? A naturalistic perspective, think a person who maybe is an atheist or does not believe in God. They're going to see this life is all there is, but we know that there's much more. How does that impact the stakes? Well, if you're essentially just living a hedonistic life, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I mean, if you're just essentially living for the way it feels and feels good and chasing good feelings, well then, if this life is all there is, that's something. If this life is not all there is, and if there is a judgment afterwards, well, that's a totally different thing. And so the stakes change. So now here we go again. We show, this is the same from before, problem, solution, resolution. These are our three parts of our story. Now let's look at this. Let's begin to put a little more meat on these bones. You've got sin. This is the rebellion. You've got Jesus. That's the decision point. And specifically, I mean Jesus' work on the cross an invitation to the world. And then you've got salvation. So let's go back to that previous slide. Your problem, your solution, your resolution. Your problem, your solution, your resolution. God's kingdom. Okay, so that's our three things, right? Now let's put that in a narrative form. Let's put that into words. And let's talk about a very brief presentation of the gospel. Now this is just, I wrote this. I mean, I didn't originally write it, but these are my words. God created the world good, but we rebelled. Each of us are guilty of going our own way, and because of this, we've made a mess of things. It's not hard to look around and see this. All right, let me back up for a second. Look at the first one. We've essentially been talking about that first dot, sin. But God, being good, did not want to leave us like this, so He came, as Jesus, to give us a way out of this. The solution? We must turn from our broken way and give our allegiance to Him. Right? That's that middle section. And then finally, not only does He save us from the bad, but He gives each of us a place to belong in His kingdom with good work to do. Now you see a full story there, right? If we go back 2 slides, your problem, solution, resolution. Let's go back forward again. Your problem is, it was all good, but we made a mess of things. Your solution is, God didn't leave us like this. He came, Jesus. Your resolution is, it doesn't end just here. This is not like a golden ticket kind of concept, right? We have a whole life. This is eternal life starts today and continues in this life, right? And He has work for us. So this is what we see. Now we've looked at structure. Let's go back and look at our 5 core elements. I realized after I did this is very like, if you could see that, I don't know how well those colors are coming through, but this is like a red and that's a purple. It's very like pride looking, but you know, you get what you get. So let's look at characters. And the reason I've done this, these are all different colors to just illustrate kind of the different words in here. Can everybody see that okay? Okay, you're good. So these keywords kind of illustrate the characters in this little story. So you've got God, we've made a mess of things, but God. So He came as Jesus. We must turn our allegiance to Him. Not only does He save us, it's His kingdom. Okay? I'm going somewhere with all this, so keep with me. Context. How does context show up? So God created the world good, but we made a mess of things. We can look around and see this. So He came, that is, to this world. And finally, in the bottom, each of us has a place to belong in His kingdom. These are all context clues. Foreshadowing. The quote I was going to use, I missed it earlier, was Anton Chekhov was a Russian novelist. Some say he's one of the best. And he said, if you hang a gun on the wall in the first act, then in the second act, that gun better go off. There's no wasted detail. The reason the writer typed out, this character put a gun on the wall, that's not just, I need a certain amount of pages for my publisher. That's because something's going to happen. But if you were to skip that detail, I'm getting a little into the weeds, but I want to make sure you guys understand what I'm following me. If you skip that first little detail, and all of a sudden the protagonist or the villain has a gun, well, where did he get that? That just seems like you're just making this stuff up now. But if you foreshadowed it, they're like, okay, well that makes sense because they put it on there. You felt like it was innocuous in the story, but really this is what's happening. So we use foreshadowing. I mean, not so much shooting people with the guns, but we use foreshadowing in this story as well too. Now notice foreshadowing is what's early, what's coming next. So you really only see it in the beginning and a little in the middle. the world was good, but we rebelled. Okay. Going our own way. All right, so you see kind of like, if you don't have this, then who cares, right? This sets up this. So that's the foreshadowing. And then ultimately, this sets up this. So he didn't want to leave us. This is what he wanted for us. So this is how foreshadowing works. All right, finally, our tension. And then we're going to move on, kind of get into it. Or not finally, but second to last. The tension in this story is words like we rebelled, right? So you can picture the king and the rebels. What happens? The king is going to punish them. We were guilty. We've made a mess of things. We're not victims, right? But God did not want us to live like this. That's tension because God is holy. So he can't, in other words, he can't accept us like this, but he also didn't want us to be like this. So there's a tension that needs to be resolved. So he came as Jesus. Philippians 2 says he humiliated himself. He came as a man in that way. Not embarrassed himself, but he became lesser for us in this way. We must turn. All right, so we have to make a choice. We can't just stay where we are. There's a tension there. We have to give up something if we're going to do that. And finally, we give our allegiance to him. And then the last one is the stakes. What are the stakes? Why does this matter? God created the world good. We can look around and see the bad, the mess of things we've made. And then finally, how do we bridge from here to here? Will we stay here forever in the mess of things? Because, we have to, the solution, we must turn. We have to turn. So this is not automatic. So we could stay here. So therefore, not only does he save us, but he gives each of us a place to belong. We might not get that salvation. He might not give us this place to belong or the good work to do if we don't turn to him. Right? So you see these are the stakes. All right. So where are you in all of this? As the hero or protagonist, how do you describe your version of the story? So you are not the protagonist in the gospel story. But you are the protagonist in your own story. So what did I say a moment ago? I said, you're not the protagonist. Well, when you're talking to somebody else, if I'm talking to you, and tell me, what's your name?
Chuck.
Chuck. So I say, hey Chuck, tell me about yourself and all these kinds of things. I'm not trying to insert, and remember that time I went to college? Like, what? Okay. I'm like, I want to hear about you. I'm not the protagonist in your story. You know what I mean? I want to hear about you, and it's going to make sense as if you're in the middle of it. Because you're not telling me somebody else's story, you're telling me your story. But we are the protagonist in our own story. And here's why that matters. Because to be a good guide, so say, Chuck, you're not a believer and you're asking me questions about God, or maybe challenging me or pushing back, and you're like, that's ridiculous, or however it's framed. If I'm going to be a good guide to you, I first need to understand where I fit in my own story. In other words, I really can't, this is perhaps debatable, but I'm probably not going to be a great guide if I don't know Jesus. Now, maybe I could just shoot in the dark and get something right. But realistically, this matters. So, let's ask this question. Is this evangelism or is it apologetics? I haven't really told you anything about defending your faith. Where would you guys land on this? It's a trick question because it's kind of an apologetics conference, but we haven't talked about apologetics.
I think defending your faith is a way to evangelize.
Mm-hmm. I can get behind that. This is what I wrote in mine. I think yes. Look at this verse. Did Brother Wade preach on this morning? I think he might have. Not this morning. So if you've done anything with apologetics at all, ever, you've heard of 1 Peter 3:15. The word defense here, the Greek word is apologia. Apologetics, right? So this is where this comes from, in part. So is this evangelism or apologetics? I would say it's both, because we're always being prepared to make a defense. So that's the apologetics element. This should be reasonable. Reason, for anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. So of course we know we can't apologetics somebody into the kingdom. We can't argue them into the kingdom. We cannot provide them a path into the kingdom of any way other than Jesus. We can't save them at all. That's the Holy Spirit's job. But we can make a defense. The point of apologetics is always to get to the gospel. Every time. If we're doing apologetics and we're taking them anywhere other than the gospel, then you can argue, I think, quite convincingly that you're not doing apologetics. Now, you could be doing apologetics for yourself, as in defending your own claims and stature and so forth. But you're certainly not defending the gospel. The point of using story in your apologetics is because it works. There's no black and white categories for when you are or are not doing apologetics. It's all a part of our witness. The question we should be answering is, how reasonable is our hope? That is what apologetics is. So, one thing, we're going to do some Q&A in a minute and just kind of talk through some of this. I want to hear a little bit from you guys, if that's okay. One thing that I have noticed is that if you can put things in the framework of a story, we'll talk about briefly about what does that mean. Does that mean you have to, once upon a time, I would say probably not. You can if you think that's helpful. But if you can understand these ideas of what are the stakes in this conversation. So Chuck and I are having a conversation and I'm like, hey man, you should get saved. Well, maybe Chuck has an understanding of that. Or maybe he doesn't. Like, saved from what? Who's after me? I've given him no stakes. In this case, I haven't foreshadowed anything. We haven't talked about sin. Maybe he doesn't know who's after him, but he doesn't even know he's a sinner. You know what I mean? All these kind of elements fit. When we use these elements together, we create something that gets implanted in our dialogue partner's mind. It's just the way we are. We're story creatures. When you give someone a lot of facts, these facts can be true, but these facts don't fit well in our mind. It takes calories for us to burn to get these into there, to implant them, to fit them. Because what do you do when you have, let's see if I can take this off without breaking my microphone. What do you do when you get a bunch of facts? You try to organize them, right? You're like, where does this fit? I need to hang this on something. I need to do something with this. When you give somebody a story, they don't have to do anything with it. It just immediately slips in. So Donald Miller, he wrote some Christian memoirs a while back, but he wrote a book called Building a Story Brand. And this is basically the business model that he created, is if you can turn your business facts into a story, then you're going to get the business. That's great. If you're a business and you're trying to make some money and that pays the mortgage and that's important, But what if we're talking about eternity, right? It's how much more important is that? I mean, that's just off the charts. Okay, so what's next? One more slide after this. We're going to do some Q&A and just kind of talk through this. I left a lot of time for this reason because there's a lot of stuff we talked about. If you want to get better at this, if you like this approach, what I would recommend is just simply observe. Pay attention. Pick whatever medium you like. If you like to read or if you like to watch movies, it doesn't really matter. One's not better than the other. Learn to spot the 3 parts and then the 5 core elements. Now, if you've read any about this, if you've studied this at all or thought about this at all, there are more than 5 core elements that exist. I've given you the 5 really big ones that are going to show up in your conversations. There are, depending on who you ask, more than 3 parts to a story, but again, I've given you the big ones. So if you do look into this more, I'd say don't, feel free to go as deep as you want, but don't see that as a defeater. Don't get lost in the weeds. These are the 3 big parts and the 5 core elements. In Persuasive Speakers, notice how they use these story principles. If you go back and watch, I probably am the only one who does this, but Steve Jobs, the guy who did Apple, the keynotes, every year they would put out a new operating system and stuff, and Steve Jobs would come out and just wow the crowd and the reporters and all these kind of people. He was a storyteller. He did not say, listen guys, let's sit down with the fire with me and let me talk about this time my granddad told. He doesn't do all that. Yet he is constantly telling a story and people are constantly listening. Story is an extremely effective way to get people to listen. Somebody asked a question today, I think it was something like, what do we do with people who don't care? Like a younger generation who just seems apathetic. Like how do you cut through apathy? I think ultimately this is what we're looking at. Don't do the hard work of trying to say, okay, listen. I've got all these facts for you. Just hang with me for like 4 hours and you are going to be very convinced. Like nobody's going to do this, right? Nobody's got time for that. Even if you're interested, that's a tall ask. Does that mean that facts don't matter? Absolutely not. A story without facts is a fiction. Any real facts that happened in real life. A story based around facts is true. So I think ultimately, the more we can incorporate this in our conversations, the more we'll see people interested. Okay, I'm going to break now for this Q&A. These might have been very new concepts for some of you. That's okay. Tell me, what questions do you have? What can I clarify? Do you want me to go back to anything? Or any non-question comments that you just want to say something and put a question mark at the end of it. I'm okay with that too. What you guys got? How would you get started with this? What would be your first step? Where would you get started? Do you know?
think we got a question right here, I think.
Yeah.
Yes?
Well, getting to what you're talking about, apathy, that's really like one of the biggest problems in apologetics. Everybody thinks it's learning, the big words and all the arguments. The hard part is getting people to listen for 10, 15 minutes.
To even
getting
care.
through the conversation.
100%.
Because they'll bring something up, and then the minute you start talking back to them, they sort of retreat, they hide in their shell. But what I wanted to ask was, if you're talking to somebody who is a naturalist, and where you have to do all that groundwork of, does God exist, before you can even get to like the gospel presentation, how would you use a story approach to do that? I mean, just where you have so much, baggage that has to be gone through first.
Totally. Well, I think one thing is to, this is what we talked about in my first session, is to ask a lot of questions. So just why? Like, why do you believe this? What is your, and I don't mean like an accusatory kind of way, like, why do you believe that? But just tell me, like, where were you born? How did you grow up? Like, what is your idea of God? I'm just curious because I have a very specific idea of God. I'd like to hear yours. I don't want to argue with you. I just want to know. And so just sort of an honest and open approach like that. So that's a data gathering. So what would this approach look like, say you're talking to a naturalist? I think a lot of times it's going to depend on what the topic is at hand. So if you've gotten to a point where you're like, hey, can I share the gospel with you? So I met a lady in my neighborhood who was a Buddhist, I think, yeah. And she was Chinese, and she didn't have great English, and so I thought she probably wasn't born here. And so I was just talking with her, and I said, hey, I'm just curious. Has anybody ever shared the complete gospel with you? Sometimes I'll qualify it like that. I'll say the complete gospel. I don't say the full gospel because that kind of gets into the charismatic thing and I don't want to mislead. But I just mean the complete gospel. I just, you've heard bits and pieces of it and I don't want to give them an out. I want to kind of almost make them doubt. And so he said, no. I said, well, is it okay if I just kind of share it with you in like a minute or two? And so I shared something very similar to that story that I wrote up there before. So that's just like blank slate, okay? Say you've got somebody who's, so that's very open-ended. Say you've got somebody who's struggling with a particular problem. So they're a naturalist and they're like, I see all of this, well, let me back up. If they're a naturalist, I'd say, well, why are you a naturalist? And I would get them to give me a reason, justify it. I wouldn't push too hard on that because why is anybody anything? These are hard things to answer for a lot of people, and that's okay. And I'm not trying to make them look dumb. And so they say, well, I just look around and it seems that, who was asking about science earlier? Yeah, I just looks around. It seems that science is disproving God. And so what I would do is really just try to understand where they're coming from. And if I'm going to share, if it's time for me to share the gospel, then I'm going to incorporate that. If it's time for me to just say a little bit of why maybe I'm a theist, maybe not even talking about Christianity yet. I'm just going to say why I believe God is real. At this point, I have not differentiated myself from a Muslim, okay? But we're just going to take a baby step. I say, well, I look around and I see all this pain. You say that too. And I know I've screwed up a lot, but what does that even mean? How have I screwed up? Screwed up against what? What standard are we talking about? So all of a sudden, all right, let me back up for a moment so we can see. Okay. All of a sudden, I've said, I see the pain and issues and stuff. I get it, like that red in tooth and claw and all that sort of naturalistic kind of verbiage. Yeah, and what do you even mean about any kind of standard? You're hinting at this. This is the foreshadowing. I haven't told them the gospel yet. I'm just saying, like, how do you get there? I mean, I know how I get there, but I'm just curious. I'd like to hear how you get there. And I'd probably just kind of ping pong back and forth and walk them through it. What really helps is to just kind of have these general ideas in your mind, because it's almost never going to be linear, unless like it was with that lady who was a Buddhist, who didn't at the end say like, yes, I would love to be a Christian. I would have loved for her to do that, but they almost never do. I mean, this is how it is. There is a real spiritual war. So I think that's what I would do. Does that help?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts or questions?
What do you do when you're witnessing to someone and you think you're making some progress, but the first time you mention Jesus, they shut down and go about their business?
That's a really great question. Can I ask you a question about that? A clarifying question? How would you measure in such a case progress? You know what I mean? Like when you say you think you're making progress, like how would you, is it their buy-in, their engagement, maybe?
We were talking just fine about how can she have a better life, and there's got to be something more out there ahead of us. And so I said, well, the only way you can be sure of this is to know Jesus. And that just shut her down.
Yeah, okay. So that's a really great question. I think there's a few factors here. So I don't know all the details of this person, and that always changes things a little, but I'm going to make up some details for us today. Some people have a hurt from the name Jesus used by Christians, or Christianity, or these things, or religion in general. Some people, they have been hurt by people who claim to be using these things or providing these things, okay? So I could go in here and talk to somebody who is clinically diagnosed with anxiety, and I could be like, hey, look, don't be anxious. That's your fault. You're sinning right now. I mean, I think, number one, I'm taking it out of context, and number two, that's not helpful. So I could use a good thing to hurt someone, right? Because we are sinful. We can do that. Matter of fact, that's how we got in this whole mess in the first place. So I think sometimes understanding that there are legitimate hurts that we inherit when we talk to people. So you have to maybe take a whole lot more time and backpedal, because there's something like this. There's an apologist, a Christian apologist, Gary Habermas. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of him. Yes. So he does a lot of facts on the resurrection. This is probably what he's most known for. But he does this other research which is very interesting, and it's on emotional doubt. A lot of times people, let's say skeptics, we'll just to put them in a clean, easy category, skeptics will present intellectual problems to the faith as if this is my reason for not believing. But in reality, it's not. There's an emotional reason behind it. Now, I don't mean to say that emotions are bad or weak or any of that kind of stuff. Emotions are how our brains value things. They're how we take facts and say, this one's more important than this one. That's why God gave us emotions. So we can experience things and know what's good, bad, and so forth. So a lot of times, it's not always clear why a person is going back. Okay, so that's one thing. Another thing to consider, so this is a separate point, would be notice the thing that changed as soon as you brought up Jesus. That person was no longer the solution. Right? So bear with me for a minute. If you're having a conversation with somebody and you've been talking about the problem, they're like, I get the problem. I am totally with you. It's a problem. How can I solve that problem? You're like, no, you can't solve the problem, right? It's Jesus that solves the problem. And the only way he can solve this problem for you is if you give up your solution and take his solution, right? That's what it means to be a follower of him. There are people that just simply don't want that. Jesus talks about the story of the guy who's doing all of the law, right? He comes up to him and he's like, what do I need to do to be saved? To be a follower of you? To follow your teaching and step into this kingdom of heaven that you're talking about? He says, okay, Jesus says, you need to do this law, this law, this law, and this law. He's basically saying you need to keep the law. The guy's like, hey man, I've done it all. And then he finally says, because we know that this was a rich guy, the story tells us, he finally says, great, now give up all your stuff. And the guy was like, I can't do that. I just can't do that. My stuff is too important to my identity. Now, I don't think in America we see that exact scenario play out. A lot of times, the reason people reject the solution is not because we say, hey, you need to sell all your stuff and I don't know what you do next, but you need to do that. A lot of times, really what they're rejecting is, hey, you need to no longer be the one that calls shots in your life. You need to be submissive. Not only submissive to God, but submissive to a local body. Nah, I'm out. So sometimes people reject simply because that's the gospel. They'll go with half the gospel, which is a false gospel. But once you get to the rest of the gospel, it's not good news to them, you know. Does that help?
Yeah, I was told, don't feel bad, they're not rejecting me, they're rejecting God.
100%. Matter of fact, if they did accept you, that's a problem, because you can't save them. So I'm sure you do a great job, but not quite good enough. Okay, anybody else have any other thoughts? We have a few more minutes. We can talk about more of these things. Anything evangelism related or sharing the
That's
gospel?
what's happening in universities. They say people that are already saved and they go to university and they somehow in those 4 years they're getting converted because the solution is no longer Jesus. If they're actually the solution, is that what the professors and stuff are trying to teach them? It ain't that. It's this.
That's a really good, I'm glad you brought that up. That's a really good point. I think what's happening in the universities is not a single thing. I think it's multiple things, okay? So I think one of the things that's happening is, we talked about this a little bit in our first session this morning, is if you go back and you go back to World War II, okay? After World War II, two very distinct kinds of people, kinds of Americans happened. One was the majority and one was the minority. The minority was, an example of it was the Hells Angels, okay? That motorcycle gang that started in California. So the Hells Angels basically were these kids who went to war and really liked killing people. Like there's just this primal kind of whatever, and they're like, we want that. And then war's over, go back home, be civil. And they're like, nah, we ain't gonna do it. So you get this kind of thing. The other reaction you got after World War II was this, what I call like the leave it to beaver, you know? Our economy was booming. There were more houses being bought than any time before in our entire nation's history. All of these things were happening. People were getting this life. And part of what was included in that life is a reaction against all the terribleness that came before. Let's latch on to a morality. And we picked the Bible. All right? And there's reasons for that. You could go back and say, were there any more Christians then than there are now? That's a legitimate question. There might not have been. No, maybe there's more people in the world, and that's not what I mean. But, you know, percentage. but it was acceptable to follow Christian biblical standards. That was acceptable, and that was appropriate. And so challenging those was inappropriate. And so as we have, I'm not making a political statement with this, so please don't hear me say that, but as we become more secular, we're looking a lot more like Europe has morally, okay? And so as that happens, it's no longer, can I pull this down a little bit, or does that come down any?
Right there.
Cord?
Yeah.
Okay. See, it's like getting in the eyes.
Thank you.
Yes. So, as this has changed, it's no longer inappropriate to challenge these things. And so what's happening is you've got kids who maybe they were never challenged. Their faith has never cost them anything. They've never had to give up anything to maintain their faith. They go to college. They're away from their parents. That forced kind of, oh, well, they're looking at me, I got to behave kind of thing is no longer there. And all of a sudden, they just, I'm okay without doing this. They were never doing it in the first place. They were pretending. And now they have what they feel like is a license to no longer pretend. So I would say it's probably not so much the professors as it is just our entire nation has moved away from God collectively. In our entire standards, we're not holding these standards. Whether we believed them or not, we held to them. We don't believe them, we don't hold to them. So I think a lot of it comes down to that. And I think a lot of this plays into that because story can help expose where that tension is, where what you want is inconsistent with what you're doing, and these kinds of things.
But when you talk to them, and they have already changed their view, they don't disagree with you. They say, yeah. If you say, well, Jesus loves you, yeah, He does. I'm glad that, God wants to have a relationship with you. Yeah. They don't disagree with you. How do you approach, how do you get that person to come back to where they are saved and they are willing to have a relationship with God, and do what the gospel says?
That's a great question.
And I'm describing it what the doctors become that way.
Sure.
They don't need to have God on their side. They've got the answers. Their solutions are what they learned in school.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a few ways I would approach that if I was with this person. And this is not just church talk, but I'm being very serious. If you believe that God is real, if you believe there is an actual spiritual world of angels and all of this, if you believe this stuff, all right, I do, then the first thing should be prayer. God listens, right? Was it Luke 16, I think it was, the persistent widow? He gives us this model and he says, look, you might not get it like that, but that's okay. Look at her model. She continued to put it before the person. So, and we continue to put it before the Father. So I think we don't forget those people. I think that's step number one. I think the more people we can have praying for them, genuinely praying for them, the better. Okay. So I'd start everything, that's our foundation, right? Because we don't have power in and of ourselves. Okay. The second thing I would do is I would talk to them about submission. This particular person that you described, and I know there's a lot more to this person, and I would talk to them about submission. You know God loves you, and all of this kind of stuff. Maybe you know you're a sinner, blah, 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 blah. But what are you going to do about it? And depending on their temperament, maybe you challenge them a little bit more directly. Maybe you don't. That's a personal thing that you got to figure out based on this person that you're talking about or two. But I would challenge them a little bit in an appropriate way. And I would say, Satan, when he tempted Jesus, used Scripture. And it wasn't like he just thumbed through the book before the test. right? He knew it pretty well. He knew it pretty well to be able to combine it in just the wrong way. Satan knows all the facts about God. He knows that God loves people and all that kind of stuff. What does the New Testament tells us? Even the demons believe and they shudder because they know. They know what their end is. So knowing that is not enough. We will not be saved for what we know. We will be saved for what we do. And hear what I say very carefully. What I don't mean is that we can work our way to salvation, right? We will be saved by saying, I will put away my old self and my full allegiance will be to you. So it's a position of the heart, a posture. That, God says, is what I will honor. That is the entrance to the kingdom of heaven. Humility. So I would challenge that person along those lines with submission, with humility, and just kind of talk with them. Say, look, okay, I'm glad you believe these things about God. What do you believe about His call to you to repent of your lifestyle? What do you believe about putting Him first? What do you believe about taking up your cross and following Him? You know what I mean? Like all these kind of scriptures that are very visual about this. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. We have a couple more minutes. Anybody else have any other thoughts along these lines we want to talk through?
Is it possible to kind of use this as for those that have come to the faith, but actually, like we're having a conversation, and I'm just thinking about some of the scenarios that I ran into. Go to Arizona the last few summers, and I remember talking to this gentleman. His name was David, and he kept on getting hung up on. Unfortunately, he killed someone about 20 years ago, and he just kept on getting hung up on that. But he loved Jesus, and he expressed that. But he just could we use something like that to help him to move along, or maybe maybe take a little bit different look of God's grace, or I don't know how I'm trying to.
I think I understand what you're saying. Can we help him change the way he views these facts? Yeah. So he loves Jesus, which means I'm just going to go out on a limb and say, I think you said he was a believer. Yeah. Okay, he's a believer. So he's submitted his life to Him, but he struggles with a past sin, the guilt of it. I mean, it's a big one. I get it. And then your question, if I'm hearing you right, is can we use any of these techniques to kind of help him change his mind? You asked the question, I hadn't planned on doing this, but talking about specific Bible stories, right? Well, I think this is exactly what Nathan did to King David. Right? He killed a guy. And other things. And why did he use that story? Why didn't he just come and say, listen, man, God, not you, the guy over you, your boss has said to me this, to tell you this. Just a messenger, deal with your stuff. He didn't do that. Why didn't he do that? I think ultimately he didn't do that because he cared about David. He cared about David. He cared about the nation that David was leading, Israel. He wanted the best outcome. So instead of just doing what perhaps could have been a minimum, who knows? Did God tell him to do that? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. So he uses a story that captures David's heart, and then kind of a surprise ending reveals it. So I would start with this guy, again with prayer, and just praying for God's wisdom and guidance and things. Praying that God would begin to work on his heart in this particular way. Sanctification, this is a sanctification problem, right? Sanctification, our growing to become more like Jesus, is a process, right? We know that. It's not clearly like a light switch, or else this world would be very different. So this is part of his process. We all have that. So in part, you could empathize with him and just say, look, man, I don't have that, but I have things I struggle with too. You know, when I was like a teenager, I can recall a few things that were the hardest things I'd ever done in my life up to that point. And then I got older and I had more hard things. So it doesn't invalidate those things that when I was a teenager they were hard. I felt those same emotions. They were hard because it was my maximum at the time. I was hitting my ceiling, right? And so just because of the fact that you didn't kill anybody doesn't mean that you're any less qualified to come along beside him and say, hey man, listen, I've had hard things too. They're not the same, but what kind of sin does God accept? None. It's all the same before him. So sometimes you could use a story approach. Sometimes you could use a rational approach. Sometimes the rational approach doesn't always work, like what I just gave you. So if you were to use a story approach, what you could do, let's go back for a minute to something. That's it. You could help him ramp up the stakes, maybe. So you're talking to him and you say, listen, man, I know you believe that you're now in the kingdom. I believe that too, but I know you've told me you believe that. I've seen evidence of it in your life. You know, you're talking to him at this point. You say, tell me, what will the new heaven and new earth be like for you? Or, you know, something like, get him into this mindset, okay? You could also help him with the tension and say, listen, you said that God delivered you, right? This is another way of saying saved. Did he really? Was his death good enough for you? Intellectually, he's going to be like, yeah, I know. And I think this is a very common thing when we deal with people and emotions and all of this kind of thing is intellectually we know something. We've gotten over it emotionally at one point and now we're back into it. It's kind of like that muscle memory. It's a process. And I think he needs, again, I don't know this guy, but I think he needs people like you and others around him who are willing to I'll just keep walking with you, bro. You know what I mean? I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to be like, you should be over this by now. I'm just going to keep walking with you. So I think there's various ways you can do it, but I think maybe the most effective thing might just be the long-suffering kind of sticking with it. So that's a great question.
I think that kind of leads into a thought I'm thinking of. Telling the story is just a great relationship. Gives you that footing to be able to, present that gospel over time.
Yeah. I mean, that's Amazing Grace. I once was lost, but now I'm found. That's a story, right? A lot is not being said in there, but a lot is being implied. That's your story and my story. That could open up a tension in their life. Oh, I've never been found. You know, I'm feeling still that tension. You don't have that tension anymore. I don't have that tension anymore. So I think you're right. Okay, guys. What time do we finish this thing?
Whatever time you would desire. But I think 6 is when the service starts. So.
Okay.
We've got 30 minutes. We can keep.
That's dangerous. I'll be around. Let me put this up real quick. Oops. Let me go back to... Okay, that's my information. So if you need me, Bo has this as well too. So if you want to email or call or any of that kind of stuff, we can talk more if you have questions that come up later. Or just offline between now and 6. If you guys want to talk about anything, I'll just be here. So...